So welcome everyone to our Civics of Education webinar. Tonight's session is being interpreted into Spanish. So we will need all attendees to select your preferred language at the globe on the bottom of your screen. So either English or Spanish. From your cell phone, touch the three dots on your screen and select your preferred language. I will also put those instructions in the chat again right now if you missed that earlier. Okay. So welcome again. My name is Lauren Scopez-Donay, and I'm here with Stanford Cradle to Career, and we're excited to host tonight's session on the Civics of Education with the Stanford Public Education Foundation and PLTI. For those who don't know, Stanford Cradle to Career is a citywide collaboration in Stanford focused on bringing partners together and resources together to help children and families get a great education and have access to opportunities for learning, exposure, and support. We do have 3 upcoming community gatherings labeled Stanford Unites. You might see it in my background for 3 different groups: a teen fair on March 10th, a gathering for parents and caregivers on March 21st, and a gathering for our community partner organizations on April 11th. It's a great opportunity to learn more about what we do and for us to hear from you and learn from you what's important to you. I'll put a link in the chat to our website that has a little more information in case you're interested in joining. And without further ado, I will now hand it over to Regan Allen, my co-host tonight from SPEF. Regan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Regan Allen. I'm with the Stanford Public Education Foundation, also known as SPEF, and I coordinate the Parent Leadership Training Institute, known as PLTI. I do PLTI and PEP, which is Yukon People Empowering People, through the Stanford Public Education Foundation. And we teach, our sort of tagline is teaching parents who care to become parents who lead. So PLTI is a civics-based curriculum. It's 20 weeks. Many of you here are PLTI graduates or currently in our PLTI class. So that is exciting to see. And I see some PEP graduates coming on too. So we started webinars during the pandemic. We're calling them PLTI 2.0. as a way for our graduates to continue their leadership journey and get some professional development. So this time, and usually when we do PLTI 2.0, we follow a lot of things that many of you have learned in PLTI, like small group protocol, HOPES, trust the process, stretch, all those kinds of things that you probably remember. Tonight, though, we're just going to, since we're partnering with Cradle to Career, and not everybody here is a PLTI graduate, we're going to do it sort of without those expectations. But I'm really excited tonight. Something that I've been wanting to talk about for a while, because it's really needed in Stanford, is to talk about policy. What is policy? For those of you that are a PLTI graduate, there is a whole class on policy, and that just touches the surface of policy within our city, our state, and the federal level. So Erika Haynes is from the Connecticut School and State Finance Project. And she came to one of our PLTI classes a few years ago during the pandemic and did a talk on school finance. And it was so amazing. We actually had to ask her back for a follow-up seminar because it was just so much information. So the School and State Finance Project started offering webinars on policy. So we said, let's bring her in because we know that she's going to give us a lot of information. For those of you who are PLTI graduates, I've been sending you a lot of information about education cost sharing and money at the state, and those all come from Erika. That's actually, she's the author, not me, those emails that you've been getting. So without further ado, I will pass it on to Erika.
Good evening, everybody. So thank you first and foremost for having me tonight, Regan, Lauren. Thank you both for including me in this. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this. We're going to talk about policy, advocacy, and where and how you can get engaged. A little about me before we get started. I am a mom of 4. I'm a grandma of 1 now. And I've been working at the School and State Finance Project for about 7 years, working on policy issues, but my role within the organization falls on the advocacy side as the Director of Community Engagement. So I'm going to walk you through a PowerPoint, and there will be some breaks during it where you can ask some questions, and then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion at the end. I've asked Regan to keep an eye on the chat too. So if you have a question and you're like me and you worry about losing, excuse me, and you worry about losing that thought or idea, I want you to know that, throw it in the chat, keep it present, and we'll get back to it. So with that, I'm going to endeavor to share my screen. And let's turn this into a slideshow so you can see it and you don't have to squint. Here we go. And I think, Regan, you'll be sending out a copy of this, right? Yeah. So you all will get a copy of this. I don't want you to feel like you have to take pictures of the screen in front of you, furiously scribble notes. Just enjoy it and consider this the start of a conversation, not one and done. You have my contact information and the contact information of 2 of my team members. If you need someone who is fluent in Spanish, Christian will be the one that you would want to reach out to, and you will have that contact information. You have information about our organization, but we really started in 2015 looking at school finance and the policy of school finance in the state of Connecticut. And we come at policy through an equity lens, looking at what is equity and how does that get reflected in school finance in Connecticut. So tonight we're going to talk about policy. What is policy? Who's responsible for making it at both the local and the state level? How do you add your voice to the process? And really importantly, where can you have the most impact? So I think when we hear somebody say, oh, I work at a policy organization, it always sounds so big to me. Like, what does that mean? What do you do? And so I want to just start by grounding in what is policy and kind of relate it to our day-to-day experiences. So policy refers to a set of guidelines that are designed for decision making. How do we make decisions? What is the guideline that we need to refer to? And the way we see this in every day is in things like the attendance policy at our kids' school, the dress code policy at a school, the return policy at Walmart. It's about the guidelines that help make some decisions. And hopefully those guidelines are meant to keep people safe, comfortable, and in the best interest of society as a whole. So within the context of government and public policy, we're talking about the guidelines at a local level, at a state level, or a federal level, and really what the government chooses to do or not to do about a problem. So policy at Walmart is a little different than public policy, because public policy is really looking at the greater good of the general public in any area. So for instance, at a local level, you have public policy made that affects the residents of Stamford. It also might affect business owners in Stamford, people who work in Stamford. At the state level, we make public policy that is intended for the good of all of our citizens in Connecticut. So this public policy, what does it look like? Well, generally, policy is made in response to an issue or a problem that requires some sort of attention. It might take the form of a law. It might simply be a regulation and not a law. It is generally made on behalf of the public and said, in the best interest of the public, we need to set this guideline straight. So it might be something like, there's probably a policy in Stamford around picking up after you walk your dog if your dog goes to the bathroom, right? Just things like that that are in the general interest of everyone in Stamford. It typically focuses on a goal. Usually that's a solution to a problem. And it is made by a government entity. Although, and I think this is one of the really important pieces that isn't talked about enough, ideas can come from outside of government for policy. So when you notice a problem that your neighborhood is experiencing or your city is experiencing, your voice and going, I have an idea on how to fix this, is contributing to creating policy. And policy making is ongoing, because when we make a rule, when we create a guideline, we have to monitor and know if it's effective. And so policies are generally reassessed. How's that going? Is it actually solving the problem we intended for it to solve? And let's kind of rethink this. And oftentimes policies are changed because at first blush, it seemed like a good policy, but as we're watching it in action, it doesn't necessarily do what we hoped it would do. So I said that policy can be a law, and policy can also be a regulation. And there are a few things that are different. A law guides decision making and really says, like this example is, the policy says that all students have to have parental permission to participate in high contact sports like football. So that might be the policy. It's determined, it's non-negotiable. We know that we need parents or guardians to consent in writing before a child plays a high contact sport like football. But the regulation might say, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to send a form home so that parents don't have to create a letter to the school, right? And the regulation says, here's how we're going to actually make that happen. And so these differences between a law and a regulation are really fine differences. And I don't want you to get too caught up in it. I do want to point out that we see this at the state level in an area like education, because teacher certification policy, for example, is done through regulations through the State Department of Education rather than the General Assembly. So it's kind of, if you think of it as like a tag team match of supporting each other. Policy and law and regulation go hand in hand. And sometimes it's just a fine difference of who's responsible for doing that? Or do we need to make a law, or can we just carry it out through regulation? Policy exists at the federal, the state, and the local level. And there's a hierarchy there. So if state policy were to conflict with the local policy in Stanford, the state policy is always the one that is carried out. Similarly, at the federal level, if there's a federal policy that conflicts with a state policy, the federal policy is the one that wins. So some of the federal examples are standardized testing. That is a federal requirement of all 50 states. Federal funding for Title I, which is for economically disadvantaged schools or districts, that's determined at the federal level. At the state level, we could talk about education cost sharing, which is how our state gets money to cities like Stanford. We could look at some really recent examples like COVID guidelines. And then over the past few years, we've seen curriculum topics that have become policy at the state level, including carrying out classes around environmental awareness and climate change, and policies around African American and Puerto Rican history. So we're seeing different examples of that. At the local level, you're going to see uniform requirements for students. You might see things like how parents can volunteer in a classroom. That's carried out at the local level. So I'm going to pause there for a second and just make space. And if anyone has any questions before I talk to you about how policy gets passed, I want to give that space. So if you have questions, feel free to either raise your hand like Jim just did. Thank you, Jim. That was perfect. Or you can always unmute. So Jim, have at it.
Sorry, I think I clapped my hands first for the great job you're doing so far.
I like it.
I was actually about to type into the chat, but is there a hierarchy? I think there are two policies, meaning can a local policy in Stanford Public Schools be out of sync with a state, or if there's a state or a federal policy that will dictate what you can do in a policy locally?
Yeah, so there is that pecking order per se, right, of federal policy overriding state policy, which overrides the local level policy. Although there hasn't been a lot of history of conflict of those things, particularly in the education space and in Connecticut. So, testing is certainly a good one of those where testing is required per the federal government. And yet how we see testing play out in all 50 states looks a little different, and those benchmarks might be different. And yet at the local level, they follow whatever the state policy is on carrying that out. So there tends not to be a lot of conflict. I think in part, if you're making good policy decisions, you're looking at the policies around you first to make sure that they don't conflict. I think one of I'm going to date myself here, although I told you all I'm a grandmother. But I think one of the most interesting areas of that policy conflict actually occurred with the speed limit on interstate highways. If you're old enough to remember, 55 saves lives. And for a while, they tied federal transportation dollars to that. If you didn't change your speed limit in your state, you lost federal dollars. So I think that's the best example. And that was really an all-out kind of conflict amongst all of our states for a very long time. And now you have that flexibility. I'm going to try, I don't want to mispronounce the name, but is that Jay Kim?
Yes, it is. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Sorry, I'm actually using my phone. Okay, you can see me.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry, my angle's a little off. I don't know if this is a question that you can really answer for me, but I'm just getting into this. I'm a new PLTI student, and I've been learning a lot in my class, and I think there's something, I guess, I don't know if this is an appropriate question for this class, but I want to better understand how different towns start magnet programs in charter schools, and how different towns seem to have like special programs such as like gifted and talented, or things like that. I mean, how the policy gets played into developing these various types of programs. If that makes sense.
This is perfect. Yeah, it does. And while there are some wonky details that I probably won't get into right now, let's use your question to talk about the process of passing policy. And we'll look at it through both. Let's actually take gifted education as our example, but then let me see if I can build on that magnet and charter question as well. So this is perfect. So I'll start into this next slide here in the process of passing policy. And so the first thing here is an idea or an issue is brought forward. So, you as a constituent and a community member can say, hey, I noticed that my school or my school district doesn't have any gifted and talented. What's the deal with that, and how do we get that? And I think that's the first question. So you would go to an elected body, right? And because this is an education question, you would probably go to your local board of education, and we'll talk about these bodies that exist within the governing bodies. But you would bring that to a member of the Board of Ed and say, what's the deal? And they're going to do some research on it to go, good question. I don't know what the deal is. And they're going to scan, and they're going to look at, well, what's the state policy on gifted education? And in gifted education, Connecticut is one of the least friendly gifted education states. So the policy in Connecticut is that districts are required to identify gifted children, but they are not required to provide any services for gifted children. So that's the policy. There's no requirement. So the idea then at the Stanford Board of Ed might be, we need to start offering gifted and talented or gifted education in some sort. They would then bring that to the agenda of the Board of Education. It might go to a subcommittee that they might have to look at, well, what does this look like and what could we do in Stanford? And they would move it back out of committee and into the whole body in Stanford Board of Ed. And Stanford Board of Ed would vote on it. They'd discuss it and decide, is the solution, the policy solution that comes out of committee, something that they think will be beneficial for Stanford Public School. At the state level, it looks fairly similar to this. So let's say we wanted to change that policy of gifted education and say, what happens if we propose a policy that says, well, gifted kids have unique needs and those needs should be met by the district. So what if we propose a change of the policy so that school school districts have to provide some sort of individualized education plan for gifted kids. And what would happen then is it would be brought into committee. It would be proposed probably by an individual legislator. So let's pick on Corey Paris tonight, because I have the utmost respect for Representative Paris, and I know he'll be okay with us using his name in this example. And if Representative Paris said, okay, let's bring this to the Education Committee, he would propose it and it would get moved to the Education Committee. They would have the discussions around it. They would actually then draft the policy and the committee would discuss it. There would be a public hearing on it where community members could weigh in, and then they'd vote on whether to move it out of the Education Committee or to say this doesn't have enough support for us to enact that. So that's that example on both the local and the state level. Does that help, Jay?
Actually, I do have a second question. I mean, I know I live in Stanford, and I know, the neighboring towns, some of them have gifted programs. And, I hate to use that word because it really labels a child as like some kind of genius, which is not the case.
Correct.
And I know neighboring towns don't necessarily call their programs gifted and talented. They call it, like, for example, in Greenwich, they call it advanced learning programs, which is fine. I mean, I don't really, the name could be really anything,
Right.
It's the offering that matters. So the question I have is, why is it that, I mean, if we have a state policy that dictates something like some kind of, kind of a policy for the whole state, why is it that different towns have different programs? Like, I mean, like Norwalk has a gifted and talented, Greenwich has advanced learning programs, but Stanford doesn't. Like, what's driving that, and why do we have that discrepancy? Yeah.
Sure. So really, in this case, the state policy is, hey, we're not telling you you have to do anything. You can decide. And so at the local level, the local board of ed, the superintendent, have to decide what the priorities of the community are and what the resources of the community are. So, I will tell you, I think part of it comes down to budget. It's about, do we have the teachers to do that? Do we have the ability to fund teachers and curriculum and resources, or don't we? And is it the priority of our community members? So there's two pieces to that. And so one of the pieces, and I'm actually gonna, let me pop ahead a little. I think one of the pieces then is as you start having policy questions and ideas, and I would say this is both, right? The question first is for you to research and to meet with people on the Stanford Board of Ed and to say, have you guys had this discussion? What's the kind of history of making the choice that we currently have? And do you think there's interest? Do you think there are the resources to support a change in policy? And that's where that discussion starts.
Yep. I mean, because, what I find is that, people love Stanford for its diversity in, all different types of culture we have. But at the same time, I think a lot of parents feel that the education could be lacking in some ways, and it's not as competitive compared to the neighboring towns. So they end up sending their kids to private school. So like, I feel, it's like you gain one, but you lose another. Like, it's like you go to private school, which becomes very homogenized. You might gain a little in terms of like academics, but you lose diversity and culture.
Right.
So I feel strongly that, we should have that in public school system. People don't have to leave public school system to go to private to get that advanced learning, have the diversity, have the education, like right here, just in public school for everybody.
And
that's just.
So now we're going to launch you on your path of policy exploration. And this is going to be the start to have those conversations. Winton. Oh, wait, you're muted.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
The first one is just a little history. I agree with the previous speaker, and my children are graduates of the Stanford High School, but the high school was not diverse because when they went to school, 98% of the white children were in the 1 and 2 cogs, the 0 and 1 cogs, and the other children were in the lower cogs. And so if you want equity and diversity, you have to kind of figure out how to make that work. I'm not sure if what they did was the best way, but I just wanted to kind of give a little history on that. The other thing is that, and my children were in the 0 cog and the 1 cog, but that was unusual. They even ate in different cafeterias.
Wow.
But the real question I have for the policy issue is when a legislative body or a group of elected people make a decision and they have the public comments after the vote, can that be appealed by the public?
Not typically. So what your lever is when, so say a policy has a public hearing and the decision is made that kind of flies in the face of what they heard in the public hearing. The next available lever to you is to vote them out.
Okay.
So, you know, other states have recall options too. We don't in Connecticut. So what they assume is, listen, if your policymakers aren't listening to the general public, they're going to get voted out and they won't have that opportunity again. And the question is, do voters actually follow through on that? So, hi,
Thank
Kieran.
you.
Sure.
Karen, can I just interrupt for 1 second? So everybody, Erika has 44 slides. I know we're not going to get to everything, but I want to make sure we move it along. So and not stick on one just topic. Jay's question was great, and I know she's working on that for her project or thinking about it for her project. But I want to make sure we have enough time for Erika to give at least some of the presentation. I don't know that we'll get to 44 slides. We might have to have you back again, Erika. Kieran?
Right.
All right, thanks, Erica. Okay, so yeah, Erica, I attended Westall High School as I graduated there in 2015. And when I attended Westall High School for 4 years, from 2011 to 2015, I've been going to the media center. The library has a roof of world flags that represents the kind of cultures, ethnicities, and nations that many of our students and teachers ancestors came from. And when I attended Westall during lunch time, however, there was 2 cafeterias. There was a French cafeteria and the Rhenish cafeteria. And one cafeteria said it was a white cafeteria, and the other one was a black cafeteria. And after that, the board of education they came up with the ideas about not calling it a white cafeteria and a black cafeteria anymore because of those cafeterias, it seemed like it doesn't make sense about why students would choose the kind of cafeteria of where they want to eat. So they had an idea about making Westall one of the most diverse schools in America, where students of any color can come to eat without such a characteristic or idea of their race or color too.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm learning so much.
Kieran,
So-
I think a lot of that still happens right now. Those of us that have students in Westall, I think it's not official, but from what I hear, that white cafeteria and black cafeteria still exists.
Yeah, I still believe. Yeah, that shouldn't be called that anymore, because to me it sounds a bit racist, and students wouldn't like that of how they're being forced to eat in the cafeteria, aware of what they should eat, you know.
Right.
Thank
So
you, Kieran.
I'm going to challenge you, Kieran, as you start thinking about this and looking at that and hearing the rest of the presentation, to think about how could policy maybe solve some of that in a different way. So I'm just going to that'll be a nice connection for you. I want to point out a few things. You're going to read policy, and policy is not written for us. It is complex, and Connecticut, particularly the state level, uses pretty old-timey language that is written for lawyers on their worst day. And so it is not easy to read. It can be a struggle. I would encourage you not to get discouraged. I will tell you that there are small things as you start learning more about policy. Words like must and shall have very different meanings. And so it's going to be the small pieces that need to be paid attention to. And even if a policy says something specific, once it's written down, everybody gets to interpret it differently. So when we talk about policy, it really is tricky. And I would caution you to be really thoughtful about it and just learning more about it. But we talk about policy and we talk about good policy, right? Is it a good policy? Is it a bad policy? And there is no one good policy. So there are questions that lead you to identify, is this a good policy or not? How acceptable is it for the community? Does it make sense to have this policy? To Wynn's point, what if the public hearing said people don't want this and it becomes a policy anyways? Or the reverse, was it created to prevent damage to a community? Was it created after there was damage inflicted on a community? Does it help create a more positive culture? Do people need this policy in order to make major decisions, or is it just to make sure that nothing goes crazy in policy? How do people feel about it? Because I'm going to tell you, there are policies that might sound awful, but are understandable. We could talk all night about all the COVID masking policies, or the COVID policy of stopping school, and whether that was good, whether that was not. So I'm telling you, there's no one magic policy, right? Where you're going to look at it and go, oh, that's exactly how it should look. There are some areas of policy analysis, like just questions for you to think about. And I'm going to just slide by this and you'll have a copy of this. And we're going to talk about local policymakers. Now, I want you to understand, I come from this statewide perspective, but I want you to make sure that you're thinking of Stamford in this. Connecticut has 169 cities and towns, all have their own local government, and the different types of local government vary, right? It's not every community doesn't have a board of education, a city council, a mayor, and a board of finance, although I believe Stamford does. So, it does vary. And if you look at another community, you might see a very different model. Stamford has a mayor and a board of representatives, and the mayor runs the daily operations of the city. And your board of representatives is your legislative body. They're the ones who are going to make policy. So a town council is the purpose and what they're there for are to look at what are our priorities today for Stamford? Where do we want to be 5 years from now? And are the policies that we're making moving us towards that? we need to make ordinances, laws at the local level that are in the best interest of the town and its residents, and the town council adopts the town's annual budget. Town councils also do a lot more than that, from overseeing how effective programs are, representing the town to other levels of government. They've got their hands full. I speak from experience as a former town council member. So then if the town council is doing all that, what's the Board of Finance doing? Almost all of Connecticut's towns have a Board of Finance or a different name for it. Their job, the biggest job, is to look at the financial state of the town. They need to make sure the budget is balanced. They set the property tax rate. They arrange for the annual audit of town accounts. But they're looking at the big picture. Everything the city needs, from parks and rec to police, and everything that education needs. And your Board of Education gets to look just at education. Boards of education are a little different. They are agents of the state of Connecticut. So even though they're elected locally, they get their power right from the State Board of Ed. And so they have jobs like budget, curriculum, programming, and the superintendent is kind of the education mayor, if you will. And so those are the two people that interact. So this interaction amongst boards, you'd kind of think they all work together, right? And yet they generally work in separate streams. And every board has to stay focused on what their role is in the system, right? City council's job is not to worry about education. Education's job is not what are we doing for veterans in the city. It's looking at K-12 education. And the Board of Finance is taking those two priorities and trying to balance them with where do we want to be as a city. So there's some tension there, and it's designed that way. We have all the ways for you to find your local elected officials. They're public folks, their names are public, their contact information is public. You have some links here. And I want to jump to the state for a second. Much like the city has your mayor, we have this executive branch that is the governor and lieutenant governor in Connecticut. And you're going to see tomorrow the governor's delivering his budget for the state. He also has the ability and authority to sign, to veto, or take no action on bills that our General Assembly creates. The General Assembly, pretty big for a small state. We've got 36 senators, 151 members of the House of Representatives, and they're all elected every 2 years. So there's a few other things. They work in committees up at the legislature, Education Committee, Committee on Children. There's transportation, there's a ton of them. So if you have an interest, you can check the General Assembly's website and go, you know what, I'm really interested. What are we doing in transportation in the state? We have your representatives and senators listed here. And I do want to just want to be really mindful of time, but I want to pivot for a second into advocacy. We've talked about policy, and now we've talked about policy makers. And I want to get to your role in interacting with policymakers. So we talk about it as advocacy, and advocacy is really any action that's taken supporting a cause or pleading a case. And I want to pause for a second, and I want to tell you that advocacy, I think we always think of in terms of like these huge things, right? The Women's March in Washington, big protest rallies. Advocacy can be small too. So when you share a post on Facebook that says, hey, the budget is coming up, or don't forget to vote in this year's election, that's advocacy. And I think sometimes we forget that those small actions really add up. So advocacy can look like emailing or calling a legislator, speaking up at a Board of Ed meeting, just showing up at a city council meeting. All of those things are advocacy. I will tell you that as you start thinking about, well, if I'm going to tell someone this thing is important to me, and you know, I think a great example, and I'm just going to call out if he's still in the room. Peter had an op-ed today about charter schools. And if charter schools are important, right? An op-ed is one way to advocate. Another is to call your local Board of Ed, to call your local level and say, what's going on with this? And I want to learn more, to call to the state level and talk to your representative. But when you say charter schools are important to me, the most important thing is that you also share why. And I bring that up because Peter's op-ed today was about State Rep Q Williams. And it tied the why is this important to me in a meaningful way. I want you to know, before we talk about your audience, that you all are experts. You are experts, and you are experts in your own lived experiences. And you can say education is important to me because I didn't have a great educational opportunity and I want my kids to have more. You could say I had a great educational opportunity and experience and I want more kids to have that. There's no one right way. But I want you to always remember, you're the expert. You're the expert in why this is important to you and conveying that to others. It helps if you remember what's their frame of reference on this issue, right? Are they a parent? Are they a business owner? Are they your state representative? How much do they know about what you're talking about? Always share your truth. I share in this slide about school finance because that's what I work on. But we have a library and wealth of experiences that make things matter to us. And I would encourage you to be the hero in your story, right? And to share your story. Share the problem that you're talking about and your experiences. I'll tell you that data is not going to be the game changer in any advocacy work you have. What's going to be the game changer is your story. Again, you're the expert. Certainly share why the thing that you're rallying for will kind of get to the outcome that you want. And I'm going to tell you, add your voice year round. Too often, like right now, it's budget season, and we're talking about budgets on a local level, on a state level, but they were building that budget in October. So when you're talking about it now, it's like, I want you there in October so that they hear you from the start and they build in the things that are important to you. So advocate year round, advocate at all levels. There's not one right way to do it. Know that it's not just decision makers that matter, right? It's also people, you all know people who do a lot for your community. Those folks matter too, right? The people who are out there all the time, they influence things. And finally, I'm going to end with don't go it alone because I've just thrown a lot at you. policy advocacy. Do it all the time, do it in all these different ways. And if you follow that, you're going to be tired. And that's not what we want either. So, don't do these things alone. And you call somebody and find your five, make a small group and find your five. And maybe my group includes Kieran and Jim and Regan and Lauren. And I say, I can't go to Board of Finance. I can only go to City Council. Can someone go to some of these other meetings? So we all show up in different ways and we all stay posted on what's happening. So I want to thank you for giving me all this time and attention. I know this is a lot. I'm happy to take questions. I look forward to continuing the conversation with all of you. Now, how you doing?
That was awesome. So good, Erika. You are going to be back for some of these PLTI classes, and I'm going to borrow your slides for PLTI handouts on local and state government. So we really appreciate it. Does anybody have questions for Erika? There was a lot of information, but I also want to say what she said at the end, don't go it alone. We, with Stanford PLTI alumni, a lot of times with Cradle to Career do advocacy things together. So there's always opportunity to be together to be advocating for common goals. Questions?
Let me see.
And I'll say, while folks are thinking about questions, I did put in the chat a link for a very brief feedback survey. We like to know how we did and how we can do better and what else you'd like to see on similar or different topics. So please fill that out before you head out. It'll literally take you a minute or less.
What's your question, Kieran?
Hi, Erika. So yes, so since that many high schools in the city of Stanford and across the United States have at least two or one police officer has a school resource officer, do you find it necessarily safe that young kids who were in middle school or elementary school had a police officer with a school resource officer, and how these kids and teachers could feel safe too?
Oh, this is obviously a really conflicted topic, right? School and safety resource officers. And I'm going to tell you, it depends, right? And the people whose voices matter most in that are the students. So I participated in a conversation where somebody who was leading the conversation had an idea that school resource officers should not be in school. And when the students on the panels talked, they said they actually felt like it made them feel safer in their schools. And I think what matters is, first of all, I think we center on students all the time and what their experiences are and what they believe to be true. I think that the second thing is, it depends how those officers have been trained, taught to support students, if they're really there to keep them safe and to help them. We know school-based arrests lead to horrible outcomes for kids. So, you don't want that. But at the same time, I'll never forget these kids saying, we don't want the adults to take away these people that we trust and that keep us safe every day. So I'll tell you, there's no good answer there, but it's a good policy question.
Thanks, nice.
Erika, thank you so much. I learned also a lot. And I think it's so important, the last part that you said, that we have to be united. And like as a Latino, many times we don't have the language. So, but it's important that we make a presence in the meetings and asking, being the voice for people who cannot speak the language. So I think it's important that, thank you. It was so good to learn, to remember from PLTI and to this point. Thank you so much. As Regan said, looking forward to see you again.
Thank you so much. All right, y'all. Yeah, you don't have more questions, but you have my email and my team's email. So please feel comfortable reaching out. This is what we're here for.
Thank
Lauren?
you so much, Erika.
Erica, and thank you, Alba, our Spanish interpreter this evening. We appreciate it so much. And everyone will receive an email with the slides and the contact information and a link to the recording, which will eventually be on our website as well. Check out our community calendar with more upcoming events, and do give us some feedback on what you want to see. We're in partnership at Cradle to Career and Stanford Public Education Foundation here to help make what happens what's important to you. So thanks again for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.
I appreciate Erika and Lauren, and thank you for sharing me your slides. And I hope to see you again soon in future as well.
Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Okay.